There is a city buried beneath the story we thought we knew. A city of bronze and ritual and strange, beautiful power, built by people whose name we don't even know with certainty, whose language has left no decipherable trace, whose existence was so thoroughly erased from human memory that for more than 3,000 years the world simply forgot they had ever been there at all. Not lost the way some ancient cultures are lost, dimly remembered in fragmentary texts or corrupted legends, not partially forgotten the way Rome faded into myth. Gone, completely, almost impossibly gone. While Egypt was raising its new kingdom pharaohs, and the Mycenaean Greeks were building the walls that would inspire Homer, while traders moved across the Mediterranean and empires rose and fell, along the Tigris and Euphrates, somewhere in what is now southwestern China, a civilization of extraordinary sophistication was doing something entirely its own, something nobody in the outside world apparently knew about, something that vanished so completely that even the people who inherited that land, the ancestors of modern Chinese civilization, seem to have had no memory of it. And then, one ordinary afternoon in 1986, a construction worker's shovel hit something in the earth that changed everything. That's the shape of the story we're going to follow tonight. It's a story about what gets remembered and what gets lost, about the strange lottery of archaeology, about how entire worlds can exist and flower and collapse and leave almost nothing behind except objects buried in the ground, waiting. It's about a culture called Sanxingdui, which you may never have heard of, which for a long time almost nobody had heard of, and which turns out to have been one of the most remarkable civilizations of the ancient Bronze Age anywhere on Earth. Think about that for a moment. Somewhere on this planet there was a major Bronze Age power, a city with sophisticated metallurgy, monumental architecture, elaborate religious practices, a ruling class with access to resources from hundreds of miles away. A place that was, by any reasonable measure, the equal of civilizations we spend enormous amounts of time studying, and it was simply missing from the story, not disputed, not reinterpreted, not understood differently by different scholars, just absent. A blank space in human history that nobody knew was blank, because nobody knew there was anything there to miss. That's the peculiar thing about lost civilizations. You can't know what you don't know you're missing. The ancient Chinese texts that recorded the early history of what became Chinese civilization, the histories and chronicles and classical records that scholars have pored over for centuries, none of them describe anything quite like this. There are hints, perhaps, fragments that might refer to something older, stranger, further west, but nothing that clearly maps onto what archaeologists have now pulled from the earth. This civilization wasn't suppressed or deliberately erased as far as we can tell. It simply never made it into the written record in any form we can read, which means archaeology is the only door we have. The objects themselves are the testimony. Bronze masks with eyes that protrude several inches from the face, trees made of metal reaching toward ceilings, figures standing nearly 2 meters tall, their hands positioned in gestures that still mean nothing certain to anyone alive today. Jade and ivory and gold buried in pits, deliberately, carefully, as part of some ritual we can only begin to guess at. Who were these people? How did they build what they built? How powerful did they become? And how far did their reach extend? And perhaps most hauntingly, what happened to them? Why did their great city fall silent? Where did they go? Those are the questions that are going to carry us through this night. If you're listening to this right now, wherever you are in the world, I'd genuinely love to know. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is there. Someone is always hearing these stories at midnight, someone else at dawn, someone on a train or in a bed with the lights already off. All of you drifting towards sleep on the same current of questions about people who lived and built and disappeared long before any of us arrived. Let's go back, way back. To a world before writing remembered it. To understand why Sanxingdui is so startling, you have to place it in its proper moment in time. Because this isn't some dimly ancient story from the edge of prehistory. This is the Bronze Age, a period we actually know quite a lot about. A period with names and dates and dynasties and texts. A period that feels, compared to the deep human past, almost recent. Around 1500 BCE, give or take a few centuries, the world had already developed several distinct centres of complex civilization. Egypt was in its new kingdom, the era of Ramesses and Tutankhamun, the era of vast temple complexes and elaborate burial practices and a bureaucratic state sophisticated enough to manage millions of people, along the length of the Nile. Mesopotamia was cycling through empires with a regularity that suggests the region was essentially too fertile and too strategically important to stay unconsolidated for long. The Mycenaeans were raising stone walls on the Greek peninsula that would still be standing thousands of years later. In the Indus Valley, cities like Mohenjo-Daro had risen and were now declining, and in northern China, along the Yellow River, the Shang dynasty was producing some of the most sophisticated bronze work in the ancient world, casting ritual vessels of remarkable complexity, developing a writing system that would eventually evolve into modern Chinese script, building a state we have actual records of. This is the world Sanxingdui belonged to, not the world of early humans reading landscapes and hunting antelope across open savanna, the world of chariots and palace records and trade networks spanning entire continents, the world we typically assume we understand reasonably well. And that's exactly why it's so strange that a civilization of this scale could simply be missing from the story. We accept, on some level, that there are prehistoric mysteries, cultures that left no writing and only faint traces in the soil. We expect gaps in that part of the record. But the Bronze Age is supposed to be better documented than that. Civilizations at this level of complexity, with this degree of metallurgical sophistication, with monumental architecture and organized religious practice and long-distance trade, these are civilizations that typically leave marks. They show up in each other's records. Egyptian texts mention foreign peoples. Mesopotamian archives catalogue trade routes. The Shang oracle bones, those inscribed pieces of bone and shell used for divination, give us glimpses of a world where the Shang kings were keenly aware of their neighbours, their enemies, the territories beyond their control, a major centre of power in the Sichuan basin, not all that far in the grand scale of things, and yet nothing, no mention, no recognition, as if the entire world west of the Central Plains simply didn't exist in the Shang imagination. Part of that has to do with the Sichuan basin itself. Picture it, a roughly oval depression in the earth, ringed almost entirely by mountains. To the north, the Qinling Range. To the west, the edge of the Tibetan Plateau, one of the most formidable geographic barriers on the planet. To the south, more ranges fading into what is now Yunnan. To the east, the Yangtze cuts its way out through gorges so steep and dramatic that they remained one of the most difficult passages in China until the 20th century. Inside all of this, the basin is extraordinarily fertile. The Min and Fu rivers carry meltwater down from the mountains. The soil is rich, the climate is mild if famously overcast. There's a saying in China that dogs bark at the sun in Sichuan because clear days are rare enough that the animals find them alarming. The basin holds mist, it holds warmth, it holds water. For an early agricultural society it was close to ideal, but those same mountains that made the basin so productive also made it isolated, not completely cut off. We know that Sanxingdui had access to goods from distant regions, jade from sources far to the west, shells from the coast, bronze metals requiring sources that weren't local. Trade did move in and out. People and ideas did cross those ranges. But the connection was limited enough, difficult enough, that the civilization that developed inside the basin had enormous room to develop on its own terms. It wasn't absorbing influences from the Shang and trying to replicate them. It wasn't a provincial offshoot of some larger tradition. It was doing something genuinely independent. Geography has a way of doing this. It creates envelopes, spaces where particular experiments in human organization can run their course without constant interference or absorption. The Greek city-states developed partly because mountain ranges divided the peninsula into small defensible pockets. Japan developed its distinctive culture partly because the ocean created enough distance from the continent to allow independent evolution. The Sichuan basin gave Sanxingdui something similar, a cradle, a protected space, room to become itself. The same geography that enabled that independence also contributed to how completely it was forgotten. When the civilization eventually collapsed or transformed, there was no neighbouring power close enough or connected enough to record the loss. No diplomatic archive in the Shang capital contains a puzzled entry noting that the people to the west had gone quiet. No trade record marks the moment when goods from Sichuan stopped arriving. The basin's isolation meant there were no outside witnesses, and without witnesses there was no memory. This is something worth sitting with. The story we tell about the ancient world, the one with Egypt at one end and China at the other, and Mesopotamia in the middle, that story isn't the whole world. It's the world that left the right kinds of evidence in the right places at the right time. It's the world that got written down, or whose monuments were prominent enough that later people couldn't help but notice them, or whose successors had reasons to preserve the memory. The absence of a civilization from that story doesn't mean the civilization wasn't there. It means it fell through the cracks of transmission. It means the chain of memory broke somewhere, and nobody on the other side of the break knew what had been lost. Sanxingdui broke that chain almost completely, and for 3,000 years the story of ancient civilization was told without it. Textbooks were written, theories were developed, maps were drawn showing the spread of Bronze Age culture across the Eurasian landmass, and right there, in that fertile isolated basin surrounded by mountains and mist, there was a blank space that nobody knew was blank. What this means, when you step back from it, is that human civilization was never a single story. It was never one line of development moving forward from one origin point, spreading outward, becoming more complex in a single progressive direction. It was always multiple experiments running simultaneously, multiple populations finding different solutions to the same fundamental challenges of organization and meaning and power and survival. Some of those experiments fed into each other, influenced each other, merged and transformed. Others ran in near isolation, produced something remarkable, and then collapsed or transformed into something unrecognizable, leaving only the physical evidence buried in the ground. The mainstream story of ancient civilization tends to emphasize the connected parts, the Silk Road, the spread of agricultural techniques, the diffusion of bronze-working knowledge across the old world. These connections are real and important, but they are not the whole picture. And every time archaeology turns up something like Sanxingdui, something that was clearly sophisticated and clearly independent, it forces a revision of the picture. It adds another thread to a tapestry that is already more complex than most people imagine, which is, in its own way, a quietly radical thing. The history of the ancient world is not a story we have finished telling. There are still civilizations in the ground, still blank spaces on the map that we don't know are blank, still chapters missing from the book. Sanxingdui is one of those chapters, and to understand it properly you have to start where all civilizations start, with the land itself, with the rivers and the fog and the particular fertility of one enclosed valley surrounded by mountains at the edge of the world's highest plateau. That's where we're going next. Stand in the Sichuan Basin on almost any morning, and you will understand immediately why people stayed here. The mist sits low and heavy over the fields, blurring the edges of everything, turning the distant mountains into suggestions rather than facts. The air is warm and damp and impossibly green. Rivers move through the landscape not as occasional features but as a constant presence, threading between terraces and reed beds, feeding into each other, spilling outward into braided channels that shift with the seasons. This place is wet in the way that very few places on Earth are wet. Not tropical, not swampy, but persistently, generously, almost overwhelmingly moist. Everything grows here. Everything has always grown here. The Min River comes down from the north, carrying snowmelt from the mountains that ring the Tibetan Plateau's eastern edge. By the time it reaches the heart of the basin, it has picked up speed and sediment and the cold clarity of high-altitude water. It doesn't arrive gently. In flood season, the Min is enormous, spilling across its banks, redepositing soil in rich dark layers across the lowlands. Over thousands of years, those repeated floods built up some of the most fertile agricultural land in all of East Asia. The soils here aren't just workable, they're extraordinary. Deep and dark and loaded with mineral content washed down from the heights. An early farming community that figured out how to manage the Min's flooding and channel its waters into fields didn't just have enough to eat, it had surplus. And surplus is the engine of everything else. The Sanxingdui culture understood this landscape intimately. Settlements clustered near river channels where irrigation was possible, but not where flooding was most severe. The evidence suggests a careful reading of hydrology, a generational accumulation of knowledge about which banks were safe, which channels were reliable, which seasonal patterns could be counted on. This wasn't accidental habitation. This was active management of a complex water environment by people who had been paying close attention for a very long time. What the rivers enabled went well beyond farming. Craft production at scale requires not just raw materials, but the ability to move those materials and to concentrate workers and to organize production in ways that scattered rural settlement can't support. River systems do all of this. They make transportation possible. They allow specialists to cluster in places where goods can arrive and finished products can leave. Along the Min and its tributaries, settlements grew denser than the surrounding landscape would naturally have produced. People weren't just scattered across the basin wherever the land was good. They were organizing themselves around the water, building communities of a kind that eventually produced the thing we now call Sanxingdui. The mountains that enclosed this world shaped it in ways that went beyond simple isolation. Think about what those ranges actually meant in practical terms for people living 3,500 years ago. The Qinling to the north was not a casual crossing. The western edge of the plateau rises so steeply and so high that even today the roads that traverse it are engineering achievements worthy of serious attention. The gorges to the east, where the rivers eventually push through toward the Yangtze, were notoriously treacherous. Trade moved through these passages. People moved through them. Ideas moved through them, but slowly, with difficulty, with enough friction that whatever entered the basin from outside had time to be absorbed and transformed before the next influence arrived. This meant the culture developing inside the basin had unusual latitude to evolve on its own terms. When you can't easily import solutions from neighbouring peoples, you have to develop your own. When outside powers can't easily project force into your territory, you have to build your own structures of authority. When the materials you need for prestige production require long and difficult trade routes rather than simple purchase from a nearby market, those materials become charged with significance in ways they might not otherwise acquire. The isolation wasn't total, as we'll see when we examine what Sanxingdui was actually made of, but it was substantial enough to matter enormously. There's also the question of what the climate contributed to vulnerability, not just prosperity. The same rains that fed those extraordinary soils also came irregularly. The Min River in flood was generous. The Min River in prolonged drought or in catastrophic flood was devastating. The basin's fertility was real but conditional, dependent on seasonal patterns that didn't always cooperate. A society organized around managing that river system was also a society organized around the risk of the river system failing. This may have had something to do with the intense ritual life that seems to have characterized Sanxingdui at its height. Cultures that depend heavily on factors beyond their control tend to invest heavily in attempts to influence those factors through ceremony, offering, and structured religious practice. The landscape created both the conditions for prosperity and the anxieties that prosperity alone couldn't dissolve. What emerged from all of this, over centuries of farming and flooding and river management and careful ecological reading, was something that can fairly be called a regional state, not a replica of the Shang pattern to the northeast, not an offshoot of anything identifiable elsewhere, a distinct political and cultural entity that was shaped at every level by the particular logic of this particular environment. The mist that made the dogs bark, the rivers that built the soil, the mountains that defined the edges of the possible world, all of it fed into the making of a civilization that looked like nothing else the Bronze Age produced. The basin didn't just support Sanxingdui. In a real sense, it created the conditions under which something like Sanxingdui was not only possible but almost inevitable. Somewhere in that extraordinary enclosed river-threaded landscape, given enough time and enough people and enough surplus and enough isolation to develop independently, something remarkable was going to happen. And it did. Sanxingdui looks, at first glance, like an explosion. You see a dense core of walls and houses, workshops and ritual spaces, then beyond it a halo of smaller sites, like embers thrown off a fire. Bronze appears in quantity, strange and magnificent. Gold, jade, ivories, mass burial of objects that must have taken decades of work to assemble. To a modern eye, it can feel like a sudden arrival. One day there were scattered farmers in a misty basin. The next, a fully formed Bronze Age kingdom with its own aesthetic, its own rituals, its own way of thinking about power. But that's not how human societies work. Before the great city, there were centuries upon centuries of quieter lives, layered under the ground like the sediment from the Min River's floods. To understand Sanxingdui, you have to go back to those older layers, to a time when there were no walls here, no cult bronzes, no palaces, just people, fields, and slowly changing habits. Archaeologists call much of this time Neolithic, the age of polished stone and early farming. In the Sichuan basin, that story begins thousands of years before Sanxingdui's peak, on river terraces and low rises that to an untrained eye still look like nothing more than slightly higher ground in a rice field. You can imagine one of those early villages, a handful of houses, round or slightly rectangular, sunk partly into the earth for stability and coolness. Walls of wattle and daub, roofs thatched with reeds, dogs barking at night when something moves in the darkness beyond the firelight, pigs rooting in the trash pits. The fields just beyond the houses are small, irregular patches, carved from the wild vegetation piece by piece. Millet grows first, it's hardy, forgiving. In some places, rice appears early too, though not yet in the carefully terraced paddies you might associate with southern China. At this stage, a field is still an experiment, not an institution. People are feeling out what this landscape will allow, which spots hold water, which dry too quickly, which flood and ruin the crop if the river swells too suddenly in late summer. Hunting and gathering don't vanish. They mix with farming in a shifting balance. Nuts and wild fruits, fish pulled from side channels, deer and boar brought down in the forests at the basin's edges. Bones in the archaeological record still show a lot of wild species. The fields are important, but they're not yet everything. Over centuries the balance tilts. You see it in the plant remains. More domesticated grains, fewer wild seeds. You see it in the bones. More pigs, more cattle, more water buffalo, gradually fewer wild animals. You see it in the trash pits that ring the houses, where broken stone tools give way bit by bit to new materials. First finer stone, then polished axes and adzes that make clearing land easier. Later, here and there, early bits of copper and bronze. You also see it in where people choose to live. Those earliest Neolithic sites in the basin tend to be small, scattered, often short-lived. A few decades, a century, then abandonment. Flooding, soil exhaustion, social friction. Any number of reasons could push a group to move. But as time passes, sites start to persist. Houses are rebuilt in the same spot. Pits are dug where earlier pits filled in. Pottery styles shift through time on the same patch of ground. That continuity is a clue. People are becoming more tied to particular places. Agriculture does that. Once you invest years in learning how a field behaves, it's hard to leave it behind. Once your dead are buried beside the houses, under the courtyards, you have emotional and ritual reasons to stay as well. This is how hierarchy begins to emerge too, not as a single decision to crown a king, but as a gradual stacking of small advantages. Some families end up with better fields, some gain control of the best land close to a reliable channel. Some have more pigs, or more cattle to pull ards through the soil. Some learn to manage irrigation ditches first, gaining the power to decide who gets water when the rains fail. We see hints of these differences long before any palace foundations appear. In burial grounds, some graves begin to stand out. One person is buried with a finely made jade blade, another with several high-quality pots and an ornamental shell or stone bead. Others have little more than a simple pot and a few tokens. The variation isn't extreme yet. Nobody is buried with the staggering wealth we later find around Sanxingdui, but the pattern is there. Some lives, and some deaths, are starting to count for more. In the houses there are clues too. Some dwellings are slightly bigger, slightly better built. Some have evidence of specialized activity, more bone tools for weaving, more stone drills for bead making, more slag from early metalworking. Early craft specialization is taking shape. A few people spend more of their time making things for others, rather than just supplying their own families. Complex civilization is built from these tiny unequal steps, multiplied over generations. Copper doesn't appear as a sudden technological revolution either. It seeps in, one small object at a time. A knife here, an awl there, perhaps a decorative fitting or a bell. The ores likely come from upland regions around the basin. Someone, or a chain of someones, is carrying raw material down into the lowlands. At first, metal is rare and precious, then more common, then essential. By the time we reach what archaeologists in this region call the Baodun culture, Several centuries before Sanxingdui's fluorescence, the picture looks different again. Now we see fortified settlements on low rises, with earthen walls and ditches, several of them spread across the western Sichuan plain, each enclosing dozens of hectares. Are these early cities? Regional centres? Something in between? Archaeologists argue about that. Some point to the scale of the enclosures and the organisation needed to build them, moving earth, coordinating labour, planning defences. To them, Bowden looks like the skeleton of a regional society, already capable of big collective projects. Others are more cautious. The interiors of those sites aren't yet as densely packed with architecture as later Sanxingdui. The walls might have been as much about flood control or status display as about military defence. What almost everyone agrees on is that these walled Neolithic and early Bronze Age sites are part of the deep background of the Shu tradition, the cultural thread that Sanxingdui represents at its most spectacular. This is the part of history where the absence of written records presses hardest. Later Chinese texts mention a polity called Shu in the Sichuan region, and legendary kings with names and deeds. But for the period we're talking about now, those stories are retrospective, written centuries after the fact, filtered through layers of myth and political need. The earth, not the texts, is our main source. Pottery styles, for example, are one of the clearest threads archaeologists can follow. Certain decorative motifs, certain vessel shapes, appear in earlier Neolithic sites and then continue, transformed but recognizable, into the Sanxingdui horizon. The way people built hearths, the way they laid out houses in relation to each other, even the recipes they used to mix temper into their clay, all of these tiny details carry cultural continuity. The challenge is deciding what those continuities mean. Does a shared pottery style indicate a single people, with a unified language and identity stretching across centuries, or just overlapping networks of communities trading ideas and goods, each with its own politics and myths? When we see larger sites emerging, are we looking at early states, in anything like the later Chinese sense, or looser coalitions clustered around ritual centres? Different scholars draw the lines in different places. Some emphasize the long local foundations, the idea that Sanxingdui is the mature expression of a basin-wide Neolithic tradition that had been differentiating from its neighbours for millennia. In this view, the great city is the culmination of local experiments in farming, water control, and social ranking that began as soon as people started staying put. Others leave more room for pulses of outside influence. They see similarities, for instance, between some early Sichuan artifacts and those of cultures farther down the Yangtze or in central China. They suggest that migrants, traders, or even displaced elites might have sharpened the trajectory of development here, introducing new techniques or ideas that local communities then made their own. The evidence allows both possibilities, and perhaps some combination of them. Archaeology can show us when a wall was built, what kind of clay a potter preferred, which animals were being eaten, where the metal in a blade probably came from. It cannot by itself tell us what people called themselves, how they justified authority, what stories they told about the first opening of a field or the first rising of a city wall. What we can say, cautiously but with some confidence, is that Sanxingdui did not spring from nothing. Before the great city there were centuries of farming families learning the moods of the Min and its sister rivers. There were small villages trying out different ways of living together. There were early centres like Bowden experimenting with walls and communal labour. There were gradual accretions of wealth, status and ritual practice, layer upon layer. When the moment came for a truly monumental centre to rise on a bend of the river, a place we now call Sanxingdui, it was built on foundations that were already deep, already local, already tangled with the soil and the water and the fog of the Sichuan basin. In the next step of the story, we'll watch that quiet background sharpen into something unmistakable. The emergence of a city that turned those long, slow experiments into a coherent and powerful way of being in the world. When Sanxingdui finally appears in the archaeological record, it doesn't tiptoe in. It steps onto the stage already tall. By the time we can recognize it as a distinct urban center, people have been living on that patch of ground for generations. Earlier houses, earlier pits, earlier ditches lie underfoot, blurred into soil. But something changes around the late 2nd millennium BCE. The scattered structures and modest enclosures condense. Earth is moved in quantities your Neolithic ancestors could hardly have imagined. A city takes shape. Imagine walking toward it across the plain. The first thing you'd notice wouldn't be the houses. It would be the wall, not a little fence to keep in pigs. A broad earthen rampart several meters high when new, thick enough that a team of labourers could stand side by side along its top. Built from rammed earth, layers of soil, gravel and clay compacted again and again until they form a solid mass like artificial stone. Straight sections, angled corners, deliberate curves. This is not casual piling, it's engineering. To build something like that, you don't just tell a few neighbours, let's grab shovels this weekend. You need plans, you need measurements, you need someone to decide where the wall should run, how thick it should be, how high, where the gates will cut through, and you need people, lots of people. Archaeologists estimate that the walled core of Sanxingdui enclosed on the order of 3 square kilometres, maybe a little more. That number is abstract on paper. In lived experience, it means this. If you walked from one side of the city's heart to the other, you'd need time to do it. You could get lost among its lanes. You could spend a day visiting households and still not meet everyone. Outside the wall there were more people, satellite settlements, craft areas, fields stretching away toward the river channels. The line between city and countryside starts to blur. Sanxingdui is not just one dense knot of buildings. It's a whole landscape organized around a central place. Inside the enclosure, the ground is anything but uniform. In some zones, excavators find dense clusters of post holes, hearths, and packed floor layers, evidence of houses built, burned, rebuilt, extended, cut into, and abandoned over generations. Domestic life layered, compacted, replaced. In other areas, the traces of everyday living thin out. Instead, you get wide packed surfaces, large pits, foundations for structures that must have loomed above the surrounding roofs. One elevated area, often interpreted as the core palace and ritual district, has yielded massive architectural remains. Platforms of rammed earth, lines of post bases that once held timber pillars, connected courtyards and open spaces. This is where the spectacular bronzes, gold masks and jades seem to cluster most densely in the ritual pits nearby. This suggests a city with zones, places for living, places for working, places for ruling, places for the sacred. Sometime during its peak you could have stood in a workshop quarter and heard the steady rhythmic clink of stone moulds being prepared, the hiss of molten bronze poured into them. You might turn a corner and smell the tang of bone being carved, lacquer being prepared, jade being ground smooth on abrasive stone. Specialization is written into the debris. Here, clusters of bronze slag and broken moulds. There, concentrations of worked ivory offcuts. Elsewhere, piles of unfinished or broken pottery in the same styles that end up in elite contexts. People are not all doing the same thing anymore. Some households are weaving, some are smelting, some are shaping ritual objects that will never touch ordinary hands. To keep all of this running, someone has to coordinate. When you see a continuous city wall, it implies agreements that stretch beyond one harvest. A wall does not go up in a single season. It needs maintenance, erosion repaired, breaches patched, ditches redug, gates rebuilt after heavy rains. That means labour obligations, whether formal or informal. People being called out year after year to work on shared structures whose benefits and meanings are defined by whoever has the authority to speak for the whole. Sanxingdui's scale suggests that authority was not just the soft influence of respected elders. You don't get hundreds of workers to move earth for weeks without some combination of power, persuasion, and organisation. Maybe that authority wore a king's title. Maybe it sat in a council of lineages. Maybe it was embodied in the priests who spoke for ancestors and gods. The archaeology can't tell us the job descriptions, but the buildings you need such people for are there. The city's growth reads, in the soil, as a series of pulses. A new stretch of wall added, a residential zone densifying, a major platform built up in careful layers, each one tamped down, then topped with another, gradually raising a hill that didn't exist before. At some points the construction seems to have been intense, almost frenetic. At others, there are signs of quieter maintenance, of daily life playing out under the shadow of older monuments. If you zoom out in your mind's eye, Sanxingdui starts to look less like an isolated curiosity and more like what it is, one of the great capitals of the Bronze Age, even if its name in its own time has been lost. It doesn't have the stone pyramids of Egypt or the baked brick ziggurats of Mesopotamia. Its monuments are made of different stuff, rammed earth, timber, packed clay, and above all ritual bronzes. But the underlying pattern feels familiar in a broad sense, a central place drawing in resources from a wide hinterland, walls asserting control over a defined space, specialized crafts feeding elite demand, ritual and governance intertwined in monumental architecture, a city that both organizes and advertises power. Caution is important here. We shouldn't imagine Sanxingdui as a Chinese Thebes, a mirror of Mycenae, or a twin of the Shang capitals in the north. Each of those centres had its own political logic, its own economic base, its own ritual grammar. The people at Sanxingdui were not copying foreign blueprints. They were responding to the realities of the Sichuan basin, its rivers, its soils, its trade routes through the mountains. But within those constraints, they reached a level of concentration and coordination that puts them in the same broad conversation as other Bronze Age powers. Consider the labour embedded just in the bronzes alone, mining ore in upland zones, hauling it overland, smelting, alloying, casting, finishing. Multiply that by the hundreds of objects we've already found, and remember that ritual pits are only a sample of what once existed in use. Then add in the day-to-day demands of feeding a large urban population, maintaining irrigation, building and repairing houses, producing textiles, organizing long-distance exchange. This is not a marginal village eking out a living at the edge of someone else's empire. It is a centre in its own right. Regional surveys show clusters of smaller sites around Sanxingdui that seem to orbit it, their material culture closely linked but not identical. Some appear to have specialized roles: production, agriculture, perhaps local ritual. The pattern looks like a hierarchy of settlements, with Sanxingdui at the top as the node through which goods and influence flowed. From the perspective of someone living in one of those satellite communities, the city might have loomed as a place of both opportunity and obligation. You might travel there to present tribute, to attend a ritual, to work on a wall-building project or in a craft workshop. You might come home with new styles of pottery, new ideas about ritual, maybe a bronze tool that subtly shifts the balance of power in your home village. We can't see the conversations, we can't hear the speeches, but we can see their footprints, the boundary ditches that channel water in coordinated systems, the repeated rebuilding in the same elite quarter as ruling groups remake the physical symbol of their authority. The decision, at some point, to dig vast pits and fill them with objects that could have continued to advertise power if kept in use. Sanxingdui's emergence, then, isn't just the story of a city getting bigger, it's the story of a whole region being reorganized around a new kind of centre. Fields and villages and trade paths that once related to each other loosely now have a gravitational focus. Authority, who commands labour, who controls bronze, who decides when the great rituals are held, concentrates. Some people rise along with the city walls, others find themselves more tightly bound to obligations they didn't choose. From a distance of 3,000 years, with no surviving local texts, much of this can only be inferred. But the basic outline is clear. By the time Sanxingdui stood at its height, with its broad walls, its crafted quarters, its palatial platforms and ritual zones, it was not an outpost. It was a capital, a place where power resided, was displayed in shimmering metal and carefully built earth, and radiated out along the rivers and across the misty plain. in that concentration of power, in those monuments and masks and walls, we can start to glimpse the people who sat at the top of this vanished order, the kings, elites, and ritual specialists whose choices shaped the city's life, and whose vision for a time made Sanxingdui one of the great centres of its age. If you'd wandered into Sanxingdui at its height and asked, "Take me to your leader," nobody would have handed you a business card, but they could have pointed up toward the raised platforms, toward the quarter where the houses were larger, the posts thicker, the courtyards wider, and the objects different. This is where hierarchy starts to come into focus. Most of the city, as far as we can tell, was built of perishable things: timber frames, wattle and daub, thatch. Those leave ghostly traces, post holes, stains in the soil, patches of compacted floor. In the elevated core, though, you get something else. Rammed earth foundations that took tens of thousands of blows with wooden tampers, repeated rebuilding in the same spot as one monumental structure is replaced by another. That's a clue. Ordinary families don't normally invest generations of labour into raising the same platform again and again. Ruling groups do. In that central district, you can imagine compounds enclosed with fences or walls, with inner courtyards where few feet could tread without permission. Food coming in from the hinterland, bronze and jade arriving from workshops and distant sources, people bowing, announcing themselves, waiting to be summoned. We don't have inscriptions telling us titles. There is no list of King so-and-so year X carved into stone, but the architecture and objects cluster in patterns we recognise from other early states. A small number of places with big buildings, rare things, and signs of large-scale feasting. Many more places with smaller houses, humbler goods, and the usual detritus of daily life. Hierarchy shows up not in one spectacular object, but in the way everything is distributed. Look at the bronzes, the giant masks, the tall tree-like structures, the towering human figure that may have once held an elephant ivory tusk. These are not household shrines. You don't set one of those up in the corner of your living space like a family altar. Their scale is public, or at least restricted public, made to be seen by crowds or by select audiences brought into ceremonial spaces. Casting them required enormous quantities of metal and fuel. Designing them required skilled artisans who weren't also spending half their day hoeing fields. Organising them required someone with the authority to command resources and decide what the sacred should look like. That someone probably wasn't a single person in every circumstance. Power can be collective, councils of elders, lineages, rival factions. But the end result is similar, an elite few concentrated around the core of the city, able to marshal labour and materials on a scale no ordinary household could dream of. And at Sanxingdui that power seems to have been soaked through with ritual. In some ancient societies, you can at least imagine a distinction between the king as administrator and the priest as ritual specialist. Different offices, different costumes. At Sanxingdui, the material we have doesn't make that line easy to draw. Think of that famous standing bronze figure, almost life-sized, with outstretched hands and an elaborate headdress. His clothing is patterned, his ears are pierced, his expression is stylized, calm, almost distant. Some scholars see a king there, others see a high priest. Others suggest the categories blur, a ruler whose authority comes precisely from his ability to bridge the human and the supernatural. If you lived in a village outside the walls, you might never meet him, but you would feel his reach, in the timing of big ceremonies that required your grain or your labour, in messengers arriving to summon people for wall repairs or for the construction of yet another platform, in the ritual paraphernalia that filtered outward, smaller bronzes, specific pottery styles, ways of honouring ancestors that echoed what was done in the city's heart. Above all, you would encounter the idea that some people in that walled centre had a special relationship with powers you could not see. They decided when to speak with ancestors, when to petition spirits of river and mountain, when to consecrate or bury objects whose very material, bronze, gold, ivory, jade, marked them as extraordinary. Later Chinese texts, written many centuries after Sanxingdui's zenith, preserve shadowy memories of a polity in this region, the ancient kingdom of Shu. They speak of early kings with resonant names, Kankong with protruding eyes, Yufu associated with fish, Biling who emerged from the waters. Some of these legendary rulers are said to have taught agriculture or irrigation, to have opened up fields in the misty basin. Others are linked with strange bodies or miraculous transformations, more spirit than human. Their stories are tangled with myth, morality lessons, and political agendas of much later times. Do these Shu kings map onto the people who ruled from Sanxingdui's platforms? We don't know. The timelines only partly overlap. The texts were written in distant courts, based on oral traditions and political memory that had already been filtered and reworked. The names, if they ever referred to historical individuals, might correspond to rulers at entirely different sites, like later Chengdu plain centres such as Jinsha. But the legends do capture something that fits the archaeology, a memory of rulers in this region whose legitimacy came from more than just muscle and walls. Kings who were, in some sense, sacred. Back on the ground, in the soil, centralization shows up in quieter ways. Take the raw materials. Sanxingdui's bronzes contain copper, tin, and traces of other elements that likely came from different geological zones. The ivory hints at elephant populations far from the immediate plain. Jade materials match sources in distant mountains. These don't appear in random household trash. They cluster in elite precincts and ritual pits. To get that flow of rare resources, someone had to control routes, organize expeditions, or maintain relationships with neighboring groups who did. That kind of coordination isn't the work of independent villages acting in isolation. It's what you see when a center can claim tribute, impose trade terms, or at least act as the indispensable hub through which goods pass. Monumental earthworks tell a similar story. A city wall doesn't go up because everyone just happens to build their fence in the same place. Irrigation ditches that align across fields don't appear from a series of unrelated personal projects. They suggest plans, measurements, and the ability to enforce them. For the people at the top, those projects would have been double-edged tools. On one hand, they were practical. Walls shape movement and perhaps offer defense. Ditches bring water. Platforms create stable ground above floods. On the other hand, they were statements. Standing on the raised terrace of the central compound, looking out over the rammed earth wall and the spread of roofs beyond, a ruler could see something tangible, evidence that the city, and by extension he or she, could command the efforts of thousands. Every tamped layer underfoot was a sediment of obedience. Yet in a world where drought, flood, and disease could erase entire seasons of careful planning, muscle and engineering weren't enough to keep people's loyalty. Legitimacy likely hinged on managing two realms at once. You had to show you could organize fields and canals, store grain, direct trade, and mobilize workers. That if enemies came, the walls and warriors would hold. But you also had to convince people that the invisible world was on your side, that the ancestors approved your line, that river spirits would not drown your fields, that the strange staring bronze masks with inlaid eyes were not just artworks, but potent interfaces, watching and being watched, ensuring that cosmic order flowed from the high platforms down to the lowliest hut. When things went well, good harvests, successful hunts, peace along the river corridors, that blend of practical leadership and ritual performance would reinforce itself. The king or the leading lineage could point to the results. See, the ancestors favour us. See, the water flows where we direct it. When things went badly, the same fusion of power and sacredness could turn brittle. Were the spirits angry? Had the ruler failed in ritual obligations? Did the wrong lineage sit on the platform? In that tension, change and crisis would eventually ferment. Much later in the story of Sanxingdui, we may see the traces of exactly such a rupture, when vast ritual pits are dug and filled in what looks like a single extraordinary gesture. For now, though, in the period of the city's height, the picture in the dirt is of a stratified society, a ruling class at the core, entourages of specialists around them, and the bulk of the population supporting both with their labour and their belief. At Sanxingdui, kingship, if that's the right word, wasn't only about sitting higher than others. It was about standing at the crossing point between fields and spirits, walls and masks, human need and the unknowable forces beyond the mist. And nowhere does that crossing point appear more vividly than in the bronzes themselves, objects so unusual that when modern eyes first saw them, they struggled to believe they belonged to any known chapter of Chinese history at all. If you could walk through that central compound when the city was alive, before the earth closed over it, the bronzes would not be lying in pits. They would be upright, waiting. Some would confront you at almost human height. Others would tower above you, reaching with outstretched branches and curling leaves. Some would stare straight ahead with eyes so large and so intent that you might feel, just for a moment, like the watched rather than the watcher. Sanxingdui's fame today rests on a small cluster of objects, but in their own time these weren't artworks in the modern sense. They were participants. Start with the faces. Imagine a mask, wider than your outstretched arms, cast in gleaming bronze. The cheekbones sweep outward, the jaws heavy and squared. The ears flare to the sides, pierced to hold something, perhaps real feathers or tassels, long since vanished. The most arresting feature is the eyes, enormous, almond-shaped, protruding in a way no ordinary human skull could manage. On some pieces the eyes project so far forward that they look almost like separate tubes inserted into the face, staring down an invisible horizon. These aren't caricatures. They're deliberate exaggerations, repeating the same design choices across multiple masks and heads. Whoever commissioned them had a clear idea of what a powerful face should look like. Some scholars see myth in those bulging eyes. They point to the later legend of Kan Kong, the protruding-eyed king of Shu, and wonder if these are his ancestral echoes, frozen in metal. Others suggest something more abstract, beings who see beyond the ordinary range of human sight, able to pierce fog, darkness, or the barrier between worlds. Or perhaps they mark status, a way of saying, this is what a ruler looks like when his inner vision is made visible. We can't be sure. What we can say is that the eyes are not subtle. These bronzes refuse to let your gaze just drift past. Then there are the heads. Some are full three-dimensional busts. Others look like severed visages, flat at the back, perhaps once attached to wooden bodies or mounted on poles. A few wear intricate headdresses, banded and tiered, as if they support something heavy above, a crown, a plume of feathers, or in one case perhaps a real elephant tusk. Their mouths are thin and straight, rarely smiling. Noses are long, ridges sharp. They seem calm, even impassive, but never soft. Line them up mentally next to the bronzes of the Shang far to the east. Shang ritual vessels also have staring eyes, bulging and alert, but they emerge from animal masks and swirl among dragons and fanged beasts. The overall impression is crowded, busy, full of movement. At Sanxingdui, by contrast, the faces are stripped down, the human figure steps forward, ornament clusters in the headdress and the ears, while the plane of the face remains open, smooth, unencumbered. It's as if two Bronze Age cultures, contemporaries in time but separated by distance and tradition, each took the same basic toolkit: bronze, casting moulds, ritual display, and asked entirely different questions about what power should look like. Beyond the faces, things get stranger. In one pit, archaeologists uncovered a bronze tree standing several meters tall. Its trunk rises from a round base. From it spring multiple tiers of branches, curling in elegant arcs, each sprouting tiny leaves and strange fruits. Perched on some branches are small birds. From others hang what may be blossoms, or perhaps mythical objects we can't even name. The whole thing is impossibly delicate for its size, a lattice of curves and projections that would bend or snap if mishandled. To make something like that in bronze isn't as simple as pouring metal into a pot. Sanxingdui's metal workers were using piece mould casting, a method where you first sculpt the intended shape in clay, then build a mould around it in sections. The original model is removed or destroyed, a hollow left behind. Then molten bronze, an alloy of copper, tin, and sometimes lead, is poured in. For small objects, this is challenging but manageable. For something as tall and intricate as the sacred trees or the near life-sized human figure, the difficulty skyrockets. The moulds had to be made in many interlocking parts, each capturing some slice of the final surface: faces, fingers, folds of clothing, segments of trunk and branch. Core supports, also in clay, had to hold the hollow spaces open so the bronze wouldn't collapse inward as it cooled. The metal itself had to be melted in substantial quantities and kept at the right temperature long enough to flow through every narrow channel before solidifying. Too hot, and the mould could crack. Too cool, and the bronze would freeze part way, leaving gaps and weak points. And even if you got the pour right, the job wasn't over. The mould had to be removed without shattering the new bronze. Casting seams had to be trimmed and polished. Inlays of gold foil or other materials added. In some cases, separate parts were cast and then fitted together like a three-dimensional puzzle. To organise all this, you need more than a clever craftsperson. You need workshops with specialised tools, stockpiles of charcoal for fuel, reliable access to ore, copper and tin, and people who know how to smelt it. You need apprentices who spend years learning to recognise the precise colour of metal at the right heat, the sound of a mould that's drying properly, the faint cracks that mean you have to start over. In other words, you need an entire hidden infrastructure behind every gleaming face. The style of these works suggests that this infrastructure had been operating for generations. The Sanxingdui bronzes don't look like hesitant first experiments. They look like the mature product of a local tradition that had already refined its own visual language. Look closely at that tall, standing figure again, in your mind's eye. His body is columnar, slightly rigid. The hands are extended forward, forming a circle as if clasping something now lost. Perhaps an ivory tusk, perhaps a ritual staff, perhaps a symbol of authority whose form we can only guess. His robe falls in straight vertical bands. Geometric patterns run along the hem. The feet stand on a plinth shaped like a monster or stylized animal. Human poised on beast. Upper world supported by something more ancient and wild. This mixture of restraint and extravagance runs through much of Sanxingdui art. Faces are simplified, almost mask-like, but headdresses explode into complexity. Rising antler-like prongs, winged forms, spirals. The bronze trees are all branching delicacy, yet their bases are solid, low, weighty. Tiny birds are rendered with care, perched calmly in a cosmic arbour that might represent some mythic tree of life, an axis linking heaven and earth. Or it might represent something else entirely, a genealogy of ancestors, a map of realms, a vision seen in trance. We're dealing with a culture that left no known writing, so meaning has to be approached sideways, through repetition, context, and comparison. Those protruding eyes appear again and again, on masks, on heads, on figures. They seem to mark a certain class of being. That consistency hints at shared stories, perhaps taught to children at firesides, enacted during seasonal rites, referenced with a simple phrase that everyone then understood. The trees cluster with other objects in what look like sacrificial pits. They were not tossed casually. Broken, yes. Burned sometimes. Carefully arranged often. So whatever they meant in life, in their final act they were collected and consigned together, as if closing a long-running conversation with the unseen. Art in this setting is not merely decorative. It is evidence. Evidence that a group of specialists were authorized to shape the very image of power. Evidence that the community accepted, or at least recognized those images as meaningful. Evidence that the state, or kingdom, or chiefdom, whatever we call it, extended its authority into the realm of imagination and vision. If you belonged to Sanxingdui's elite, you could commission a mask whose eyes never blinked, watching over ceremonies, reflecting firelight, reinforcing the idea that certain faces were not like others. If you were one of the commoners summoned to witness a rite, you would see those same enormous eyes gazing out from the platform, framed by smoke and chanting, and feel the weight of something both human and more than human bearing down. The style set Sanxingdui apart from neighbours and rivals. To someone from the Shang court, accustomed to animal-faced vessels and oracle bones, a visit here would have been disorienting. The metalwork was just as sophisticated, perhaps even more ambitious in scale, but the visual grammar was different. Less about beast devouring and more about humans magnified, stretched into symbols. Art becomes a declaration. We are not simply a provincial offshoot of Eastern dynasties. We are Shu. We have our own ancestors, our own spirits, our own ways of seeing. Those declarations would matter in politics as much as in worship. An alliance sealed under the gaze of a Sanxingdui mask is not the same as one sealed before a Shang. The objects themselves remind participants whose world they are standing in, whose stories are being enacted. Even long after the bronzes were buried, their forms, or the myths behind them, seem to have lingered in regional memory. Later legends of odd-bodied kings and strange trees do not match the artifacts neatly, but the echoes are there, like distant thunder from a storm that has already passed over. For now, in the city's heyday, the bronzes stand. Faces with unblinking eyes, trees of metal bearing impossible fruit, human figures holding absent tusks. They condense beliefs we can only partly reconstruct, display identities that once felt as solid as rammed earth, and embody a kind of power that needed more than walls and weapons, a power that insisted on being seen. Soon enough, that visibility will be reversed. Those same bronzes will be broken, burned, buried deep, vanishing from sight for 3,000 years. And it's in those astonishing pits of sacrifice that we pick up the story again. When farmers in the 1980s first cut into the soil near Guanghan, they weren't looking for an ancient mystery. They were digging clay to make bricks. The shovels bit into the packed earth of an ordinary-looking field. Then suddenly fragments began to appear. At first they looked like just that. Fragments. Odd pieces of bronze, some scorched and twisted. Bits of jade. Shards of something that might have been bone or tusk. It took time for archaeologists to organize a proper excavation, and when they did, they realized this wasn't a scatter from a ruined building or a tomb looted in antiquity. The finds clustered in deep, deliberately dug pits. 2 major pits at first, discovered in 1986. Later, in the 2000s and 2000s, more would be found, 6 in one concentrated area. Together they form one of the most startling depositions of ritual material in the ancient world. If you stand at the edge of one of these pits as it is carefully peeled back layer by layer, the scene is strangely intimate and strangely violent at the same time. There is order here, and there is destruction. The contents are a kind of inventory of Sanxingdui's highest value objects, but seen at the moment of their unmaking. Near the top, archaeologists found ash and charcoal, the clear traces of strong sustained fire. Bronze pieces lie warped and blackened, some fused together in clumps as if they had been heated almost to the point of melting. Ivory has split and cracked, its outer surface often burned away. Jade shows heat damage, that faint cloudy patina that comes when a stone endures more than just the gentle warmth of a hearth. Deeper down, things become denser. Human-shaped bronze heads and masks folded or snapped at the ears, their dominating eyes still glaring but their edges crumpled like paper. Fragments of the tall bronze trees, branches broken off, birds detached from their perches. The standing figure's parts scattered, his robe, hands and base separated and pressed into the mass. Gold appears in thin sheets and foils, crumpled, torn, sometimes still clinging to the bronze surfaces they once adorned. These were likely appliques, delicate coverings that flashed in firelight when the bronzes stood upright. Now they lie like fallen leaves, bright against the darker soil. Ivory tusks, dozens of them across the pits, are stacked, interleaved, sometimes deliberately cut. Some are unburned, others singed, as if different loads were added at different moments. The sheer volume suggests long-distance trade or tribute. Elephants did not roam this river plain in large numbers. Their teeth had to come from elsewhere. Scattered among these are jades, elegant bidiscs, Kong tubes, blades and axes, some in styles reminiscent of older Neolithic traditions from far to the east, others more local in flavour. Many are chipped or snapped in clean fractures, as if broken on purpose rather than simply worn down by time. Everything is mixed together, masses of bronze, gold leaf, ivory, jade, charred soil, sometimes even small bits of cowrie shells, rare stones, and the occasional human bone fragment, though not enough to suggest large-scale human sacrifice in these particular pits. To an early observer, this looked almost like the aftermath of a catastrophe, a temple fire, a raid, a panicked burial. But the more carefully the pits were excavated, the clearer it became that nothing here was random. The pits themselves were dug intentionally, their walls clean and purposeful. Layers of material show patterns of placement. Large bronzes were sometimes laid in specific orientations or stacked in particular ways. Burned earth overlies unburned ivory, hinting at sequences of activity, perhaps burning first elsewhere, then transportation, then burial, or burning directly in the pit before the final covering. This deliberate combination of destruction and arrangement changed how scholars saw Sanxingdui. Until these discoveries, the site might have been interpreted as just another regional Bronze Age settlement. Interesting but not transformative. The sacrificial pits revealed something else, a centre capable of amassing extraordinary wealth and then, astonishingly, choosing to destroy it, or to appear to destroy it, because that's the heart of the puzzle. Why take objects that required so much labour, skill, and imported material, bronze from smelted ores, ivory from distant elephants, jade from quarries hundreds of miles away, and break them, burn them, and bury them in deep holes? One interpretation sees these pits as grand offerings. In many cultures, the logic of sacrifice is not thrift, it's extravagance. You demonstrate devotion or gratitude by giving up something you could have used. The greater the value, the greater the gesture. By that reading, these pits are like colossal votive deposits. The community, or its rulers, are making an offering to powerful beings, ancestors, gods, spirits of the land or river. The bronzes, with their unblinking eyes and elaborate trees, may have served in rituals for years, even generations, before being retired in this dramatic way. The breaking and burning could be part of that retirement. When you give an object to the spirits, you sometimes have to make sure it no longer operates in the human sphere. You kill the artifact so it can live in another realm, snapping a jade blade, folding a bronze mask, scorching an ivory tusk. These acts might be less about destruction and more about transformation. Another line of thought runs darker. Perhaps these pits mark a moment of political upheaval, even regime change. Imagine a rival faction overthrowing the ruling line that had commissioned and displayed these bronzes. The new powers might want to eliminate the old symbols of authority, but in a way that still recognizes their dangerous potency. Smashing and burning them would neutralize their force, burying them would remove them from public view, and placing them in a carefully dug pit would contain whatever sacred energy lingered. In this scenario, the pits become both a purge and a kind of fearful respect. You don't just toss the old gods on the trash heap, you put them away with ceremony, even as you deny them a future above ground. A third possibility threads between these two. Maybe we are seeing not a sudden crisis, but a planned closure. Ritual sites sometimes have lifespans, an altar, a temple, a sacred precinct, used intensively for a period, then deliberately shut down when its cycle is complete. At that moment of closure, the community might gather its most charged objects, subject them to fire and breakage to mark an ending, and then bury them together as a final act. The later discovery of multiple pits, some overlapping in time but not identical, suggests that this wasn't necessarily a one-off event. It might reflect a sequence of closures, renewals or restructurings, ritual, political, or both. Yet every neat interpretation runs up against specific stubborn details. If these are pure offerings, why the emphasis on breaking? Why not place the bronzes whole, gleaming and intact for the spirits to appreciate? If this is a violent overthrow, where are the clear signs of burning architecture, mass graves, chaotic looting debris that usually accompany such events? The rest of the site does show change and disturbance, but the pits themselves are too careful, too composed to be mere dumping grounds. If this is closure, what exactly was being closed? A single temple? An entire phase of the city's ritual system? A dynasty? Even the sequence within a single pit can be hard to pass. Burned layers sit atop unburned ones. Some bronzes are so heavily deformed by heat that they must have been close to an intense fire. Others nearby show almost no warping at all. Were objects preheated in a separate location and then relocated? Was the pit reopened multiple times? Were there stages, gather, burn, break, rearrange, cover, that unfolded over days, months, or even years? The evidence allows plausible stories. It refuses to settle on one. What everyone does agree on is the scale of the sacrifice, whatever the motive. Hundreds of objects, many of them unique masterpieces, effectively removed from circulation. The amount of metal alone represents an enormous investment of labour. Add the imported tusks and jades, and you begin to see the pits as not just religious features but economic statements. Sanxingdui could afford to do this, and yet afford is the wrong word. Because what makes the pits haunting is precisely that choice to send so much value into the ground. When archaeologists first lifted the broken head of one of those human figures, when they retrieved the shattered pieces of the bronze trees, they were not just recovering art, they were interrupting a decision made 3,000 years ago by people who, for reasons still opaque to us, believed that the right place for these things was not under open sky, but sealed in darkness. Buried, yes. Forgotten, no. At least, not at first. For some generations after the pits were filled, stories must have lingered, told in the region about what had been laid to rest there and why. Only later did even those memories thin and vanish, the precise meanings dissolving while the objects endured silently below. Today, the pits look like treasure hoards to modern eyes. To their creators they were something else, a closing of a chapter, a sacrifice of astonishing magnitude, a ritual act whose logic we can circle, infer, test against parallels but never fully inhabit. The result is that Sanxingdui's greatest masterpieces come to us already half erased, broken, burned, entangled with ivory and ash, forcing us to reconstruct not only how they were made, but why anyone chose to send them into the earth at all. From those depths, another set of questions rises to the surface, questions about power and connection that reach far beyond one walled city. Because to break and bury such riches, you first have to have them. And to have them, you need networks of trade, of tribute, of influence that stretch far across the Bronze Age world. To trace those networks, you have to start with the basics. Bronze does not appear by magic. It is not a single metal, but a carefully balanced mixture. Copper, tin, sometimes a hint of lead to change the flow, the hardness, the sound it makes when struck. The soil around Sanxingdui contains many things, but it is not especially rich in tin. The ores that fed those furnaces had to come from somewhere else. When archaeometallurgists look closely at ancient bronze, they can sometimes see its origin written in the metal itself. Tiny impurities, ratios of trace elements, isotopic signatures that act like fingerprints. For Sanxingdui, the picture is still blurry. Analyses hint at multiple sources. Some components may have come from within Sichuan or neighbouring uplands. Others point south, toward regions that would later supply tin to much of East Asia, mountain belts in today's Yunnan and farther beyond. Imagine caravans threading those mountains. Not caravans in the later sense, with packed roads and named routes, but small, cautious groups. People leading pack animals along narrow tracks above fast rivers. Loads of dull, heavy ore bundled in woven baskets. Sometimes the material might have moved in stages, passed from one community to the next in a chain of exchanges, gradually drifting north and east until it reached the workshops behind Sanxingdui's walls. In return, what travelled back? Perhaps salt from Sichuan's brine wells, already exploited in ancient times. Perhaps finished bronzes, jades, textiles, or simply status itself. The prestige of being tied, however distantly, to a powerful city whose kings commanded strange shining idols and ivory tusks beyond counting. Then there is jade. Sanxingdui's ritual pits contain jades in profusion. Discs, tubes, axes, fittings of enigmatic form. Jade is not just any stone. True jade, nephrite, is tough, dense, and rare. In much of ancient China it had almost supernatural associations. Purity, endurance, the stuff of immortality. Quarrying and shaping it required patience measured in seasons, not days. The most famous early source lies far away, in the river gravels and mountain deposits of what is now Xinjiang, thousands of kilometers to the northwest. Another rich zone lies in the mountains of today's Liaoning in the northeast. Closer to Sichuan, smaller deposits occur in several ranges, though their exact ancient exploitation is still being mapped. The Sanxingdui jades complicate things further. Some are carved in styles that echo much older Neolithic traditions from the lower Yangtze and the eastern coast. Cultures like Liangzhu, whose own jade altars and masks had been buried and gone out of use centuries before Sanxingdui flourished. Others looked distinctly local, part of a Sichuan aesthetic that we're only beginning to recognise. So you have two layers of distance. The stone itself, which may have travelled hundreds or even thousands of kilometres from its original beds, and the ideas wrapped around it, the forms, the motifs, the very notion that a disc or a hollow square tube carries meaning. Those ideas seem to have migrated across regions and generations before being reborn in a new context behind Sanxingdui's walls. Now consider the ivory. When you picture an elephant, you probably don't picture foggy river plains bordered by Sichuan's damp hills. And yet, in parts of Bronze Age China, elephants did roam. Their range extended farther north than it does today. But even so, the sheer number of tusks at Sanxingdui is startling. Dozens in a single pit, more across the others. Enough that archaeologists talk not just of occasional hunting, but of sustained acquisition. Some tusks might have come from elephants in the warmer lowlands of southwest China. Others may have travelled even farther, up ancient river routes from what is now Southeast Asia, where elephant populations were denser. Each one represents not just a killed animal, but a web of relationships, hunters or trappers, middlemen along the routes, officials or chiefs deciding where such valuable material should ultimately go. However those paths twisted, many of them converged on this one urban centre, bronze ores trickling in from mountain zones to the south and west, jays circulating through chains of exchange that reached eastward, maybe even brushing the same networks that fed the Shang cities on the central plains. Ivory riding the currents of southern rivers, moving from forest to floodplains to the workshops where it would be carved, stacked, burned, and finally buried. Step back, and the map in your mind begins to change. The Sichuan basin can feel closed when you look at it on a modern map, ringed by mountains, separated from the North China Plain by long distances and difficult terrain. It is easy to imagine Sanxingdui as isolated, growing in its own secluded bowl of river and fog. The evidence refuses that simplicity. Even if the people of Sanxingdui and the people of the Shang capital never stood face to face in large numbers, their worlds overlapped at the edges. They drew on some of the same resource zones. They carved jades in related shapes. They turned bronze into different forms but started with the same basic ingredients. Regional finds outside the core sites reinforce this. Scattered through Sichuan and neighbouring provinces are small hoards and tombs that contain objects in a mixed style, pieces that look part Sanxingdui, part something else. A mask motif here, a certain type of blade there. It's as if ideas and goods were circulating along the river corridors, being adopted, copied and hybridized by communities in between. Control of these flows mattered. Whoever governed Sanxingdui sat atop a web of resources that few others could match. They did not need to own every mine or patrol every forest. It was enough to dominate the key points where materials converged and were transformed. Think of the city as a node. Raw ores went in, elaborate bronzes came out. Rough tusks arrived, then left again as carved fittings, handle coverings, or offerings ready to be stacked beside the bronze trees. Unworked jade blanks became polished discs that could bind alliances, seal rituals, or travel onward as gifts. In many early states, power is not just about land or soldiers. It is about being the place where the most valued things appear. If you are the ruler who can commission a standing bronze figure twice as tall as a person, covered in gold, holding some now lost object with outstretched hands, then smaller chiefs in the surrounding countryside may seek your favour. They may bring grain, labour, or local specialties in hopes of receiving a token of your attention, a blade, a bell, a piece of worked ivory, the right to use certain symbols. In that sense, Sanxingdui's economy of prestige would have radiated influence outward, even if its actual walls were not encircled by large armies. Yet for all this, the boundaries of its reach remain hazy. we do not have written records from Sanxingdui's own people explaining their trade policies or boasting of distant tribute. Shang oracle bones hint that the Shang knew of powerful polities to the west and southwest, but whether those names correspond directly to Sanxingdui is debated. Some scholars see in the metal composition and object styles evidence of a vast Bronze Age sphere tying Sichuan, the Central Plains, the Middle Yangtze, and the far southwest into a loose but coherent system. Others caution that similarities can arise independently, and that the movement of a few luxury items does not necessarily mean deep political integration. The truth may lie somewhere in between. Sanxingdui was not an isolated island, dreaming its strange art in total seclusion. Nor was it simply a satellite of the more famous Shang kings. It occupied its own basin, commanded its own sources of wealth, and plugged into wider networks in ways that are only partially visible to us. What we can say is this: when the people of Sanxingdui lifted a new bronze mask from the mould, or placed a fresh tusk in a ritual storehouse, they were handling the endpoint of journeys that had begun far beyond the horizon they could see. They might never have walked the full length of those routes, never met the miners who first pried tin from the rock, or the hunters who first felled an elephant on a humid forest edge. But through trade, gift, and tribute, they were connected all the same. A city ringed by hills, a world threaded by rivers and paths, and somewhere in between, an invisible web of exchange that helped build a state powerful enough to rival its better-remembered neighbours, before vanishing so completely that for 3 millennia its reach existed only in the silent testimony of metal, stone, and bone. When European scholars in the 19th and early 20th centuries tried to sketch the origins of Chinese civilization, they mostly drew just one shape on the map: a single heartland along the Yellow River, a single sequence of cultures leading up to a single early dynasty, the Shang, with their oracle bones, their bronze ding cauldrons, their royal city at Anyang. Everything else was background, margins, peripheral tribes. Sanxingdui does not fit comfortably into that picture. To see why, you have to set the two worlds side by side. On one side, the Shang kings of the Central Plains, their capital built on low terraces above the river, their rituals centered on ancestral sacrifice, their bronze vessels heavy and symmetrical, covered in masks and curls that seem to stare out from every surface, their writing incised on turtle plastrons and ox scapulae, questions addressed to royal ancestors about war, harvest, childbirth, eclipses. On the other side, in the misted bowl of Sichuan, the Sanxingdui elites, their city walled with rammed earth in the same basic manner as Shang centres, their bronze technology just as advanced, sometimes more so. But the things they chose to make with that shared knowledge took a wild turn. The Shang poured bronze into deep-bellied tripods and square vessels, ding and fangding, jia and gu, forms whose purposes were clear to them and, thanks to inscriptions, somewhat clearer to us: cookers, wine vessels, containers for meat in sacrificial feasts. Sanxingdui poured bronze into towering masks with protruding eyes, into human figures with outstretched hands, into enormous trees whose branches carried birds and strange ornaments. They cast statues that seemed to be in the middle of doing something, holding, presenting, perhaps mediating between levels of the cosmos. The technical language is similar: bronze, high tin alloys, piece mould casting. The vocabulary is shockingly different. And yet, underneath the contrast, there are parallels that feel too close to be coincidence. Both worlds organized their most important rituals around bronze, jade, and sometimes cowrie shells. Both built walled centres that gathered labour and resources from surrounding countryside. Both seem to have marked social rank through access to particular kinds of objects, elaborately cast vessels or masks, specific weapon types, certain jades. Both practiced large-scale sacrificial offerings. At Shang sites, this shows up in neatly arranged pits of bronzes, in animal bones, and in human burials that were clearly not ordinary deaths. People without grave goods, bound or decapitated, placed alongside royal tombs or in dedicated sacrificial trenches. The Shang left oracles that speak bluntly of 10 captives, 50 captives, 300 people, to be offered to ancestors or to powers of nature. At Sanxingdui, we don't have writing. We have those astonishing pits, bronzes deliberately broken, sometimes burned, ivory piled in layers, jades carefully selected, then thrust into the mass. Objects that could have been displayed to awe subjects or foreign envoys instead consigned to the earth in episodes of focused destruction. The logic behind the action feels familiar. Precious materials removed from circulation and given up to something beyond human eyes. Ritual is the point where political power, wealth, and the supernatural converge. So were these two worlds talking to each other? In a direct, explicit sense, we do not know. What we can see are hints. The composition of some bronzes suggests that at times, ores feeding Shang and Sanxingdui furnaces may have come from overlapping zones. The shapes of certain jades, especially discs and tubes, show a shared heritage of symbolic forms that had been circulating since the Neolithic along river corridors. And then there are finds in the middle. Sites in the middle Yangtze and along routes between the Sichuan Basin and the Central Plains sometimes contain artifacts that look like they have one foot in each tradition. A blade in a Shang-like shape with Sanxingdui-style decoration, a small mask motif in bronze found far from Sichuan, a vessel form that is classic Shang in outline, but with features that echo southwestern tastes. You can imagine a trader in one of these in-between communities unpacking his pack to reveal something remarkable. A small bronze from the west with staring eyes and hooked nose, unlike anything a local Shang-style lord had seen. He might not care about the exact cosmology behind it. He might simply see it as potent, exotic, worthy of being placed among his own ancestral vessels. Ideas can travel like that, detached from their original meaning, reattached in new symbolic systems. But if Shang and Sanxingdui shared certain broad patterns, urban centres, bronze-based ritual, hierarchies of rank, there are also deep fractures that remind you that these were not just two provinces of a single culture. Look at art. Shang bronzes are dense, intricate, but they maintain a kind of order. Motifs wrap around vessels in bands and panels. Faces blend into spirals. The famous Taodi mask spread symmetrically across a surface, its eyes and horns mirrored. Sanxingdui art feels almost restless by comparison. The eyes bulge outward or extend on rods, as if the act of seeing itself mattered in some intense way. Mouths are exaggerated, ears elongated, headdresses sharp and geometric. Where Shang vessels speak of containing, a belly to hold food, a mouth to pour, Sanxingdui objects often seem to speak of connection. Hands raised, branches spreading, platforms and stands that may once have supported other objects now lost. Look at symbols of power. The Shang king was, as far as we can tell, primarily an ancestor priest and war leader. He communicated with the dead through divination. He led campaigns east, west, north, and south, taking captives and resources. His position was inscribed literally into bone and shell. At Sanxingdui, the central icon seems to have been something else. That towering human figure, more than twice life-size in its original form, standing on a platform gripping an object long since disappeared, flanked by masks and trees. Whatever authority it represented does not look like a straightforward ancestor portrait. It feels like a mediator with other realms, perhaps a deity in human form, perhaps a king so sacralized that the distinction blurred. Even their relationship to animals seems different. Shang bronzes teem with stylized creatures, dragons, tigers, owls, composite beasts. At Sanxingdui, animals do appear, birds on the bronze trees, dragons or snakes writhing along certain pieces, but they are less dominant than those human-like faces that stare outward with unwavering focus. So what then was Sanxingdui to the Shang world? A rival state pressing from the southwest? A wealthy partner linked by oblique trade and occasional diplomacy? A peripheral peer that developed under similar ecological and technological pressures, but largely on its own track? The honest answer may be something that does not fit neatly into any of those categories. To Shang eyes, if they ever saw it closely, Sanxingdui might have looked both familiar and profoundly alien. Familiar, because here too were walls, bronzes, elites commanding distant resources, rituals that burned wealth in spectacular displays. Alien, because the symbols, stories, and sacred beings embodied in those bronzes were not the same. The ancestors invoked were not from the Shang line. The gods, if we can call them that, did not answer to the Shang king's divinations. And from within Sanxingdui, the view may have been similar. Shang was not the centre of the world. It was one powerful neighbour across mountains and rivers. Impressive, no doubt, but also distant. Its rulers claimed connection to their own ancestral spirits, not to the beings that watched over Sichuan's fog-bound fields. If we let go of the old picture of a single centre, radiating culture outward like ripples in a pond, a different image appears, multiple bright nodes on a map. The Shang heartland on the Yellow River, the Sanxingdui complex in Sichuan, other emerging centres along the middle Yangtze, in the southeast, in the far north. Each drawing from overlapping toolkits, bronze technology, jade traditions, agricultural surplus, but each recombining them into distinct ways of being a state, of talking to the unseen, of displaying power. In that sense, Sanxingdui is not just a mysterious outlier. It is evidence that from the very beginning, what we now call Chinese civilization was plural, a chorus of regional voices. Some of those voices, like the Shang, left writing and were woven into later histories. Others, like Sanxingdui, fell silent so completely that only their buried metals and stones remember their names. To place Sanxingdui beside the Shang is not to decide which one was more advanced, more authentic, more central. It is to recognize that the early Bronze Age in East Asia was not a single straight line, but a branching river. One channel led toward the texts and capitals that later dynasties would claim as their ancestors. Another flared bright in the Sichuan fog, spoke in the language of jutting eyes and bronze trees, and then disappeared beneath the silt, leaving behind a challenge to any story that begins with only one centre, only one path, only one way to be a kingdom of bronze. If you could stand on the walls of Sanxingdui at its height, look out over the flat plain and the braided river channels beyond, it would be hard to imagine that such a place could simply stop. The workshops going cold, the ritual pits no longer being filled, the traffic of carts and porters thinning out, then vanishing. But that is what happened. At some point in the late 2nd millennium BCE, the city that could pour thousands of pounds of bronze into trees, masks, and human figures ceased to function as a living centre of power. Its people did not all die on the spot. They did not leave us a burned layer full of arrowheads, toppled walls, bodies frozen in their final positions. They left us something subtler. Abandonment. Archaeologists reading the layers of soil can see it in negative space. Construction stops. Refuse accumulates differently. High-status activity concentrates elsewhere. The city goes quiet, not with a single scream, but like a drumbeat that slows, falters, and then is no longer heard. Why? Standing on that silence, scholars have spent decades trying to hear an echo of the cause. One family of answers begins with the land itself. Sanxingdui was built near the Min River, in a low fertile basin that owes its richness to water and silt, and to the same restless forces that make rivers such bad neighbours over long stretches of time. Rivers do not stay put. They wander, split, merge, cut new channels, abandon old ones. Sometimes slowly as banks erode and sandbars shift, sometimes abruptly when floods or earthquakes push them over a threshold. Core samples taken around Sanxingdui suggest that the local landscape did not remain static during the city's life. Sediments change. Layers of coarse flood deposits appear where before there were finer soils laid down by calmer water. One line of thinking goes like this. For Sanxingdui to thrive, its elites needed control over water, over irrigation canals, over routes that let goods move along the river system. If a major flood event tore through the basin, or if a sequence of floods forced the Min to jump to a new course, that control could have been ripped away in a geological instant. Fields would be buried or eroded, canals clogged, docks and riverside neighbourhoods left stranded inland or washed out. A ritual city whose power partly rested on its command of that watery network might suddenly find itself in a less favourable position than some other node further downstream or upstream. There is an even more dramatic possibility. The Sichuan Basin sits in a zone where the Earth's crust is under stress. Historical records from much later dynasties describe devastating earthquakes in the region. Seismologists and geomorphologists have looked back and asked, could something similar have happened in the Bronze Age? In 2008, the Wenchuan earthquake, measured at magnitude 7.9, triggered landslides, dammed rivers, and altered local hydrology over a wide swath of Sichuan. It provided a modern example of what a powerful quake can do in this kind of landscape. Now imagine an event of comparable strength 3,000 years earlier. No written chronicles, no photographs, just the physical consequences. Slopes fail, sediment roars into valleys, temporary dams form then burst, rivers emerge from that chaos in slightly different positions, old channels silt up or become backwaters. Some researchers have proposed that the Sanxingdui area experienced quake-related disruptions around the time the city declines in the archaeological record. The timing is not pinned down to the very year or decade, but patterns in sediments and in river courses further north have been read as hints of large-scale tectonic disturbance. In that scenario, it might not even be the shaking itself that ended Sanxingdui's story. The real blow would be the secondary effects: water changing its paths, agriculture being destabilized, and new corridors opening or closing for trade. Environmental explanations are appealing because they offer something concrete: a flood, a quake, a river avulsion. A force big enough that even a confident, ritual-drenched elite would have to bow before it. But people rarely abandon complex cities for a single reason. If you look closely at other ancient centres that faded, the cities of the Indus Valley, for example, or certain Maya capitals, you see long, tangled stories: climate shifts interacting with political fragility, trade routes bending away, internal social stresses making communities less resilient when nature posed a challenge. Sanxingdui may have followed a similar layered script. Consider politics. A city that could organise the casting of 20-foot-tall bronze trees was not a loose village confederation. It was a hierarchy. Someone, or a small group of someones, commanded labour, directed craft specialists, defined the rituals that justified their rule. Those arrangements are never static. An ambitious rival lineage might rise in a neighbouring settlement. A charismatic leader might decide that the spirits favoured a new place, a new layout, a new set of sacred spaces. Ritual centres can be deliberately moved, their power transplanted like a tree to fresh soil. We know that not long after Sanxingdui wanes, another major site, Jinsha, closer to present-day Chengdu, takes its place as a regional hub. Jinsha's material culture shows strong continuities with Sanxingdui: similar gold ornaments, similar jades, related bronze styles, parallel ritual practices. This suggests transformation rather than total collapse. Some scholars imagine a political decision. Elites, facing environmental strain or internal conflict, shift their core operations to a better situated location in the basin. They might carry with them their sacred objects, their lineages, their myths, leaving Sanxingdui to become a ghost of former glory while life continues, redirected a short distance away. Others emphasize more abrupt change. Could there have been external enemies? A rival polity pushing in from another valley? Armed conflict that made Sanxingdui's position untenable? Archaeology loves clear signs of war: burned fortifications, mass graves with trauma, hasty defences. So far, Sanxingdui has not yielded the smoking gun of conquest. That does not mean conflict was absent. Power struggles can be brief, negotiated, or conducted in ways that leave few obvious scars in the soil. Then there is commerce. Sanxingdui sat within a web of exchange that brought in tin, copper, ivory, cowrie shells. It may have been part of long chains connecting the Sichuan Basin to the Yangtze, to the highlands between China and Southeast Asia, even indirectly, to regions far beyond. If key trade routes shifted, because of changing political alliances, because other centres seized control of choke points, because distant sources dried up or grew more competitive, the foundation of Sanxingdui's wealth could have eroded. Imagine a city whose prestige depends on spectacular bronze rituals suddenly finding it harder to obtain metal in the necessary quantities. Rival towns, better placed along new routes, begin to outshine it. Craftspeople drift away to where work is more plentiful. Ritual specialists follow their patrons. Over a generation or two, the gravitational center of the region moves. In the end, when archaeologists lay all these possibilities on the table, floods, river shifts, earthquakes, political reorientation, trade realignments, they find that the pieces refuse to snap cleanly into a single sharp-edged picture. The dates of environmental events do not match perfectly with the phases of occupation. Evidence for one kind of disruption is strong in one area, weaker in another. Jinsha's rise overlaps, but does not neatly replace Sanxingdui's decline. Some scholars emphasize the role of tectonics and hydrology. Others are more cautious, stressing that Bronze Age societies had the capacity to adapt to environmental change, and that we should not reduce complex cultural shifts to acts of nature alone. Still others focus on internal evolution, on the possibility that what we call Sanxingdui was just one episode in a longer story of a regional tradition that periodically recentered itself. There is as yet no single explanation that commands universal agreement. What we are left with is a mystery that feels appropriately ancient. A city whose elites poured immense wealth into pits, sealing their treasures away forever, then, not long after, walked away from the very walls that had framed their world. Perhaps there was a great flood in the year that elders later remembered as when the river betrayed us. Perhaps the ground shook and statues toppled. Perhaps there were heated councils in wooden halls, arguments over whether to rebuild here or to follow a visionary leader to a new site along a different bend of the river. It is entirely possible that all of these played a role, in different measures, over several decades. An overstretched political order, a gradual diversion of trade, a landscape that, with one great heave of water or earth, made plain that old assumptions could no longer hold. What we can say is that Sanxingdui did not simply flicker out and leave nothing behind. Its silence at that spot on the map is paired with new voices a little distance away, at Jinsha and other sites, speaking in a related artistic and ritual language. To understand what happened after the walls of Sanxingdui stopped echoing with footsteps, you have to follow that language as it moves, away from the old city into new centres that carried its memory forward in ways the ground has only recently begun to reveal. Follow the river east. Leave the low mounds and half-buried walls of Sanxingdui behind you, the quiet fields that now cover its old avenues. Walk along the shifting channels, through mist that gathers in the hollows at dawn, past villages whose dogs bark as you go. After a time, you reach another place where the ground has secrets, Jinsha. Today it lies beneath modern streets on the edge of Chengdu, apartment blocks, traffic, neon signs. But pull back the layers in your mind, strip away concrete, asphalt, electricity, and another city emerges. Not a perfect copy of Sanxingdui, but not a stranger either. When archaeologists first began to uncover Jinsha in the early 2000s, they were startled by a sense of déjà vu. The same basic time frame, late 2nd to early 1st millennium BCE, the same Sichuan basin environment, and most intriguingly some of the same symbols, a gleam of thin hammered gold in the earth, a mask with bulging eyes, jades shaped in familiar ways, ivory again, appearing in quantity far greater than you'd expect for a simple village. Imagine you are one of the excavators, kneeling in a square of carefully scraped soil. Your trowel hits something that rings faintly. You brush aside the dust, and a gold object surfaces, curled and crumpled from 3,000 years underground. You straighten it gently, study the pattern, a circle of swirling rays, a leaping creature part bird, part something else, chasing the sun around and around. It is the now famous Jinsha sun and immortal bird disk, an image that has become a symbol of modern Sichuan, printed on tickets and posters, cast in shining metal for museum displays. But in that moment of discovery, what matters is the echo. The workmanship, the aesthetic, the obsession with radiating, almost explosive forms. These all speak the same language as Sanxingdui's spectacular bronzes. This is not random similarity. The gold at Jinsha is thin, sometimes filigreed, delicate compared to the massive, almost brutalist bronzes of Sanxingdui. The masks are smaller, the ritual space is more modest, but the motifs, the choices of material, the way objects are grouped and buried, these link the two sites like cousins in the same family. On one hand, you can trace continuity. You see it in the shared iconography, the protruding eyes, the stylized animal forms, the importance of birds and the sun. You see it in the continued use of high-prestige materials, gold, jade, ivory, as vehicles for sacred power. You see it in the way jinsha elites still placed valuable objects into the ground, not as trash, but as offerings, pits filled with elephant tusks, clusters of jades carefully arranged, gold pieces deposited in ways that suggest ritual, not accident. It feels as if the priests and rulers of Sanxingdui did not so much vanish as change their mailing address. Perhaps their grandchildren now stand in jinsha's temples, reciting the same myths before new altars. Perhaps the old names of deities linger on their tongues, even as the buildings around them are freshly built, the city walls traced along different lines. On the other hand, there is real change. The bronzes at Jinsha, where they exist, are generally smaller, less flamboyant. You don't see the same towering trees of metal, the same colossal human figures. The focus of wealth seems to shift somewhat toward gold, toward finer work in smaller packages. Urban layout, insofar as we can reconstruct it, also differs. Jinsha does not mirror Sanxingdui's exact plan. It has its own neighborhood patterns, its own arrangement of workshops, houses, ceremonial zones. It feels less like someone picked up Sanxingdui and dropped it whole at a new location, and more like a society going through a second draft of itself, refined here, reduced there, reoriented along new lines of power, new constraints of geography and resource. This matters for how we tell the story. When people say the Sanxingdui civilization vanished, it's easy to imagine a cliff edge. One year the city is full of artisans hammering bronze, priests tending altars. The next, nothing. Silence. Empty fields and the memory of a catastrophe. Jinsha complicates that picture. If material culture leaps from one site to another within the span of a few generations, if symbols, technologies and ritual habits clearly bridge the gap, then we're not dealing with a pure disappearance. We're watching a centre of gravity move. Think of other moments in history where this has happened. The capital of ancient Egypt shifted from Thebes to Akhetaten to Memphis and back again, while religious continuities flowed underneath the palace politics. The Maya did not simply die out. When certain great cities were abandoned, their descendants kept building, farming, worshipping in new configurations across the lowlands and highlands. States can fall apart in one spot, while their traditions quietly thread themselves into new places. You can have collapse at the level of a particular court, a particular palace temple complex without cultural extinction. Elites reposition. Merchants follow new routes. Farmers adjust fields. Ritual experts carry their stories and symbols to the new seat of power. From this angle, Sanxingdui's end looks less like a sudden death, and more like a relocation under pressure. Maybe a series of floods, an earthquake, or the long, grinding change in river courses made its original situation less tenable. Maybe internal disputes split the ruling lineages, with one faction staking its future on a fresh start near what is now Jinsha. Over a few decades, the old city would thin out. Workshops would be left idle as craftspeople found better patronage in the new hub. Sacred objects might be moved in ceremony, with nighttime processions carrying masks and jades along the riverbank to their new home. Some things would be left behind on purpose, buried in pits, hidden away with the logic that had always framed Sanxingdui's rituals. Powerful objects returned to the earth, sealed out of ordinary circulation. From the vantage point of the soil map, you see one place darken while another brightens. From the vantage point of the people living it, the experience might have felt like both continuity and loss. Your grandmother still tells the same creation myth, the same animal spirits guard the fields. But the road to the temple is different now. The market square is on another bend of the river. The old walls in the distance are no longer repaired each spring. Jinsha embodies this tension. Stand in its imagined streets and you can feel the weight of Sanxingdui behind you, like an older sibling whose achievements you can't quite escape. You're using the same set of ritual tools, but in a world that has shifted. Perhaps the supply of copper is now tighter. Perhaps distant allies have changed. Perhaps population has grown or shrunk. The ostentatious, almost theatrical displays of bronze wealth give way to something subtler. Thin gold, finely carved jades, a different emphasis in how status is signalled. Was that a response to environmental stress, to new trade realities, to a conscious ideological reform as rulers tried to define themselves not as mere heirs of Sanxingdui, but as something new? We don't know, but the change is real enough that archaeologists hesitate to call jinsha simply Sanxingdui moved. At the same time, the continuities are strong enough that calling Sanxingdui's tradition lost feels misleading. A better image might be a river branching. One channel grows shallow, then dries. Another nearby deepens and becomes the main course. The water, the cultural habits, the myths, the artistic conventions, keeps flowing, just not where it used before. This is why jinsha is crucial to the question of the vanished empire. If all we had were the ruins at Sanxingdui, the temptation would be to imagine a story of sudden obliteration, a great city swallowed by flood, earthquake or invader, its people scattered, its knowledge gone. With jinsha in view, that narrative softens into something more complex. The power structure anchored at Sanxingdui did collapse as a local phenomenon. Its walls were no longer the main stage of regional politics, but the broader tradition of bronze and gold working, of specific ritual styles, of elite symbolism, persisted, adapted, and found fresh footing. Decline, in this light, is not a single event, but a drawn-out process, uneven in space and time. In the fields above Sanxingdui, the drumbeat slows and fades. Along the banks where jinsha will rise, a different rhythm gathers strength, picking up some of the same motifs and improvising new ones. Centuries later, both melodies will be quiet, buried under silt and later cities, but the ground remembers that there was not one story of rise and fall here, but a series of overlapping arcs. To follow them, you have to stop looking only for spectacular endings and start tracing how people, traditions and symbols slip sideways, surviving in altered form long after one set of walls has crumbled into the earth. Centuries pass, the last priests at jinsha die, the last bronze mask is lifted in ceremony and then buried face down in the soil. The old songs fade from the mouths that once knew every verse. But people do not vanish from the Sichuan basin. Fields are still planted. Children are still born beside the same rivers, under the same foggy mornings. What disappears is something quieter, harder to see from the outside, the thread of memory. Imagine a child born 5 or 6 generations after jinsha's final rituals. For her, the city's sacred mounds are no longer sacred. They're just slightly raised, slightly drier ground that her family uses for planting millet or building houses. The river has shifted a bit. The old course is a patch of reeds and stagnant pools. Her grandfather might point to a low-rise and say, "Long ago this was an important place," but when she asks, "Important for what?" his answer is vague. Sacrifices, maybe. The kings, the old gods. He shrugs. He's repeating words he heard from his own grandmother, words that were already losing their anchor when he was small. He doesn't know the names of the gods. He doesn't know which mask stood in which temple, or what the pattern of sun and bird meant in the oldest stories. The link between object and meaning, between place and story, has thinned. This is how cultural memory breaks, incrementally, not in a single dramatic snap. For Sanxingdui and jinsha, the problem was especially acute. They were part of a Bronze Age world where writing was beginning to record lineages and treaties in some regions. But in this corner of the basin, texts are elusive. If the Shu elites used writing at all, it hasn't survived in any quantity we've found. Their knowledge, their political theology, their sense of themselves as a people of masks and shining metal. These lived primarily in spoken words and ritual gestures, and spoken words are fragile. Think about how your own family stories mutate across just 3 generations. A great-grandparent's exact phrasing gets smoothed into a simpler version. Dates shift. Characters are combined. Someone forgets whether the story took place in one town or another, whether it was a winter of hunger or a summer of floods. Now stretch that process out over 500 years, 1,000, 2,000. Meanwhile, the world around the old Shu heartland is changing. To the north and east, other centres of power are rising. Polities that leave more written records, that standardise scripts, that later historians will look back to as the main branches of Chinese civilization. Their capitals move, their dynasties rise and fall, but their scribes keep scratching characters onto bamboo and bone and bronze. As these literate states expand their influence, they bring not just goods and armies, but narratives, stories about which places matter, whose ancestors count, whose rituals are orthodox. The Sichuan basin is drawn into those larger orbits. Trade routes shift. Local elites align themselves with new overlords. A court in Chengdu might now send tribute eastward, adopting the calendar, the titles, the ceremonial norms of a distant king. In that process, older, local mythologies don't necessarily vanish overnight, but they are folded, bent, and sometimes filed down to fit into the new ideological frame. The term Shu survives. We see it in later texts, written centuries after Sanxingdui and Jinsha were already long gone. These chronicles speak of a kingdom of Shu in the far west. They list kings with strange names. They recount tales of silkworm gods, of men with tree-branch faces, of rulers who could transform into animals. Are these stories about the Sanxingdui and Jinsha world? Maybe. Maybe not. Or maybe only in the way that a blurred reflection is about the face that caused it. By the time scribes in the Zhou or Han periods are writing these accounts, they are working with half-remembered tales, second-hand reports, and their own need to fit everything into a unified story of all under heaven. They know there is a land called Shu beyond the mountains. They know it has an old peculiar reputation. They know that once, long ago, it was powerful and strange, but they don't know about the giant bronze masks with staring eyes, or the trees of metal-sprouting birds. They don't know the layout of Sanxingdui's ritual pits, or the exact pattern of offerings at Jinsha's altars. They are not archaeologists. They are storytellers in service to a political project. So Shu, in their writings, becomes a character in someone else's epic, an exotic frontier kingdom to be subdued, then incorporated, a place of marvels mentioned briefly before the narrative returns to the courts, and battles that the authors consider central. The living thread of local memory has already frayed. The written thread that replaces it is thin, partial, and biased. This is the difference between being truly forgotten and being dimly remembered. Sanxingdui and Jinsha were not erased so totally that no echo survived. The name Shu persisted. Certain motifs, birds, silkworms, masked kings, linger in later legend. A few mountain shrines, perhaps, kept some old rituals going under new names. But the people who wrote the histories that would be copied and recopied for 2,000 years did not know those earlier cities as we know them now. They knew only whispers. To them, the Shu of myth was a shadow kingdom on the edge of the known world. Its past condensed into a handful of tales, its complexity flattened into a line or two in imperial gazetteers. From the perspective of the present, that almost looks like disappearance. For nearly 3 millennia, anyone reading the classic histories would have had no idea that, under the quiet fields of the Sichuan basin, an entirely different scale of civilization lay sleeping. No text describes the great walled precinct at Sanxingdui with its workshops and palaces. No chronicle details the sequence of offerings that filled its pits. No biography preserves the name of the artisan who designed the huge staring-eyed mask, or the goldsmith who hammered out the Jinsha sun disk. In our written record, those people never existed. Only when a farmer's shovel struck a pit in 1929, only when construction at Jinsha exposed gold and jade in the 2000s, did that silence begin to crack. It's tempting to view that long interval of ignorance as an accident, a quirky oversight of history. But if you zoom out, it reveals something more unsettling. How many other worlds like this have we lost? Not just single cities, but entire ways of seeing the cosmos, entire artistic languages, entire constellations of gods, rituals, and social arrangements that once felt as natural and permanent to their inhabitants as our own do to us. The preservation of memory depends on a chain with many weak links. You need physical traces to survive: stone, fired clay, metals, sometimes preserved texts. You need later peoples to value those traces enough not to recycle or destroy them. You need someone, at some point, to care about the story they tell and to weave it into a bigger narrative. If any of those steps fail, a civilization can drop out of the visible story. Not because it was small or unimportant in its own time, but because its successors forgot, its neighbours misunderstood, or its remains lay in places no one dug for centuries. Sanxingdui and Jinsha slipped into that gap. The basin kept feeding people. Political centres shifted. New regimes renamed old lands, rebuilt cities, recast bronze according to updated tastes. Local legends persisted as murmur and rumour, but the deep textured memory of the Bronze Age Shu, their specific kings, their precise rituals, their detailed histories, dissolved. By the time literate scholars sat down to write comprehensive histories of the realm, they were drawing maps on a landscape that had already been cleared of older signposts. So Shu appears in their pages as a hazy province, a conquered kingdom with a handful of legendary founders. The empire that had once rivaled their Bronze Age peers in artistry and scale was there, in the ground beneath their feet. But in their minds, it was gone. When you realize this, the silence between the lines of ancient texts begins to feel crowded. Each blank space on the page, each casual reference to a barbarian land at the periphery, might be covering a millennia-long story that no one bothered, or was able, to write down. And for every Sanxingdui we've stumbled upon by accident, how many others still lie under fields and cities, their memory lost, waiting for someone, someday, to scrape aside the first layer of soil and listen. It begins, as these things so often do, with someone just trying to get through their day. It's 1929, and a farmer in Sichuan is digging an irrigation ditch. He isn't looking for history. He's looking for water. The soil is stubborn, packed hard by seasons of planting and trampling feet. His shovel bites, lifts, bites again. Then with one stroke the sound changes. Metal against something that isn't just dirt. He clears away a little more and sees jade. At first it's confusing. Strange green shapes, smooth in some places, rough in others. Blades, rings, a few broken pieces. Not the sort of thing you expect to find in your field. He doesn't call a museum. There is no museum nearby to call. He's not an archaeologist. He is a man with a family to feed. What he knows is that people will pay money for jade. So the news spreads, not through academic journals, but along village gossip lines and trade networks. Word gets around that if you dig here, in this particular patch of earth near a place called Sanxingdui, 3-star mound, you might find old things that can be sold, and that is exactly what happens. Local people dig, traders come, buy artifacts by the basketful, carry them away. For a while, pieces of a forgotten Bronze Age empire change hands in markets, end up on shelves and in private collections, their original context vanishing with each sale. It takes years before scholars take proper notice. A few antiquarians collect some of the jade and bronze items, puzzled by their style. They don't look quite like the things they know from the Shang heartland. But Sichuan is far, travel is slow, and the country is going through upheaval. War, revolution, invasion. The scattered finds are curiosities, not yet a revolution in understanding. The lost city bides its time. It's not until the late 1970s and early 1980s, with more stable institutions and a growing interest in systematic archaeology, that teams begin to focus seriously on Sanxingdui. By then, the discipline itself has changed. Archaeologists are no longer merely treasure hunters seeking pretty objects. They are trained to think in layers, in contexts, in patterns of soil and ash. They measure, photograph, map. They record where each shard lies in relation to each other shard. So when they sink test pits near Sanxingdui, they are ready to see more than just old stuff. In 1986, workers digging clay for a brick factory hit something unusual. A concentration of artifacts broken and burned, clustered in a pit. Archaeologists are called in. This time the response is different from 1929. People with trowels and notebooks arrive. They expand the opening carefully, centimetre by centimetre. What emerges is not a single item, not a neat tomb, but a chaotic, intentional deposit of hundreds of objects. These will become known as Pit 1 and Pit 2, the first of Sanxingdui's famous sacrificial pits. As soil falls away, the forms that appear are unexpected. Bronze masks with exaggerated staring eyes, human-like heads with enormous ears and curling horns, a figure of a man standing on a pedestal, once holding something in front of him, his hands still shaped to grip. Fragments of immense trees made entirely of bronze with curling branches and birds. Even through a modern lens the effect is unsettling. For the archaeologists on site, used to the bronze world of the Shang, ritual wine vessels, tripod cauldrons, bells with predictable shapes and standard decoration, this feels like stepping into a different cosmos. The metal is familiar. The techniques of casting in some ways are comparable. But the artistic language is alien. Whoever made these things was working with the same core materials and Bronze Age toolkit, but thinking very differently about bodies, spirits, and the way power should look. News spreads quickly through academic circles. China's ancient past had long been narrated through a relatively clear sequence. Neolithic villages, then the rise of the Erlitou culture, then the Shang and Zhou dynasties, centered mostly in the Yellow River region. Peripheral areas were thought of as followers, imitators, or tributaries of this core. Sanxingdui does not fit comfortably into that picture. Here is a walled city with massive bronzes, complex ritual practices, evidence of long-distance trade, and an artistic system that is not a copy of anything from the Central Plains. It is not a minor variant, it is a peer. This is why historians and archaeologists are shocked, not because they believed that nothing interesting could have happened in Sichuan, but because the actual scale and uniqueness of what emerges from those pits far exceeds the vague frontier kingdom described in ancient texts. The discipline now has to wrestle with a deeper question. How many of our assumptions about where civilization was and who influenced whom are based on the accident of what was written down and what happened to survive? Once Sanxingdui's pits are recognized for what they are, the work accelerates. More surveys, more excavations, carefully controlled digs that trace the extent of the ancient city walls, the layout of workshops, the distribution of elite versus commoner housing. Archaeometrists test the bronzes. They analyze the alloys, trace the origin of the copper and tin. Some materials seem local. Others point to resource networks extending far beyond the basin, plugging Shu into a wider Bronze Age web. Meanwhile, conservation science improves. In the 1980s, objects are stabilized and stored, but bronze disease, corrosion, remains a constant challenge. By the 2000s and 2010s, new labs and improved techniques allow for more delicate cleaning, less invasive analysis. CT scans reveal casting methods. Microscopic examinations show tool marks and repairs. Every advance in technology peels back another layer of the story, and the surprises keep coming. In the early 2000s, massive development projects in Chengdu expose another cache of ancient remains, this time at a site called Jinsha. Construction workers, again, are the first to see the glint of gold and jade. This time, protocols are in place. Work stops. Archaeologists arrive quickly. What they uncover at Jinsha is different from Sanxingdui, closer in time to the end of that older city, perhaps representing a later Shu center. But the motifs are familiar. Sunbird patterns, masks, sacrificial deposits. The narrative grows more complex. Sanxingdui is no longer a solitary marvel, a one-off hallucinatory Bronze Age experiment. It is part of a longer tradition in the basin, with shifts in location, style, and ritual practice across centuries. And archaeology itself keeps evolving. By the 2020s, a new round of excavations at Sanxingdui begins, using methods that the pioneers of the 1980s could only have dreamed of. Instead of excavating open pits exposed to the air, teams build protective excavation cabins over the sacrificial areas. Temperature and humidity are controlled. Each artifact is lifted not by hand but often with the help of conservation scientists standing right there, ready to stabilize. High-resolution 3D scanning captures the exact position of each fragment before it moves. Soil samples are sieved and analyzed for pollen, seeds, and microscopic remains. Chemical tests search for residues of organic offerings long since decayed. This shift from dig and display to dig, document minutely and analyze matters. It turns the pits from a collection of strange objects into a data set. Patterns emerge, the order in which items were placed, the deliberate breaking, burning, and bending of bronzes before burial, the combination of materials, ivory, jade, bronze, gold, in specific ratios. Each new season of excavation brings another piece of evidence that forces scholars to refine their interpretations. Were the pits a single, dramatic closure ritual, marking the end of the city, or part of a recurring practice repeated over generations? How did Sanxingdui relate to the contemporaneous Shang? Trading partners, distant allies, rivals, or something more tangled? There are theories, but no simple answers yet, and that, in itself, is revealing. For a long time, histories of the Bronze Age in East Asia were told as straight lines. One dynasty after another, one centre radiating influence outward. Sanxingdui, Jinsha, and other emerging sites push us toward a different picture. A landscape of multiple centres, overlapping spheres, regional traditions that are not just passive recipients of civilization, but active creators of their own. Archaeology, in this sense, does more than add new names to an old timeline. It changes the shape of the story. It reminds us that written records, for all their value, are selective. They are the voices of particular regimes, particular elites, with particular concerns. They highlight some things and ignore others. When you put a shovel or a trowel or a ground-penetrating radar unit into the earth, you're listening for the voices that didn't get to write. The rediscovery of Sanxingdui is not just about spectacular bronzes and museum displays. It is a case study in how fragile our inherited picture of the past really is. For nearly 3,000 years, the memory of those giant masks and bronze trees existed only as distant echoes in garbled legends, if at all. Then a farmer's shovel hit jade, and gradually, layer by layer, an entire world began to reappear. Not perfectly, not completely. There are still gaps, puzzles, arguments, but enough has surfaced that we can no longer pretend the Bronze Age story was simple, or that one region alone held the keys to civilization. And somewhere under other fields, in other valleys, there are almost certainly more Sanxingduis, other centres, other ways of imagining gods and kings, waiting for their moment. Lost worlds are rarely erased in an absolute sense. They persist as stains in the soil, as altered river courses, as buried walls, as objects sleeping in the dark. As long as those traces remain, the possibility of rediscovery is there. All it takes is for someone, someday, to cut a ditch, lay a foundation, or decide to look a little more closely at what lies beneath their feet, and the silence of 3,000 years can crack open, letting another forgotten empire speak again. If you close your eyes now and think back over this vanished kingdom, what stands out? Maybe it's the staring bronze eyes, wide and unblinking. Maybe it's the notion of a city that burned its treasures and buried them, then slipped out of memory for 30 centuries. Or maybe it's something quieter, a shift in how you picture the ancient world. Before Sanxingdui, the story of early East Asian civilization was often drawn like a single river. It began in the Yellow River Valley, we were told, gathered strength in places like Erlitou and Anyang, flowed through Shang and Zhou, and then branched into later dynasties. There were side streams, yes, cultures at the edges, states on the margins, but the main current felt clear. Sanxingdui forced everyone to redraw the map. Now, instead of one great river with little tributaries, the early Bronze Age looks more like a braided delta. Multiple channels, sometimes running parallel, sometimes touching, sometimes diverging completely. The Shu tradition in Sichuan isn't a decorative side note. It's one of those main channels, a centre with its own cosmology, its own monumental art, its own way of concentrating power and performing sacred rituals. It shows that from very early on, Civilization in East Asia was not a single flame spreading outward from one hearth. It was a cluster of fires, lit in different landscapes, tending their own embers, occasionally sharing sparks. That changes more than a few textbook diagrams. It alters the questions scholars ask. Instead of, how did the Shang influence everyone else? They now also ask, how many parallel experiments in kingship and ritual were unfolding at the same time? Instead of assuming that anything impressive outside the central plains must be a copy, they look for local roots, local innovations, local trajectories. Shu becomes not a recipient, but a maker. Sanxingdui also widens the scope of who counts as a classic civilization. Massive city walls, yes. Complex bronze metallurgy, yes. But also those strange choices. The deliberate breaking and burning of elite objects, the burial of bronze trees and masks instead of their display. The power here doesn't look like neatly ordered rows of inscribed vessels in a Shang ancestral hall. It looks like masks that might have been worn or displayed or used to transform the faces of the living into something other than human. It looks like a ritual philosophy that says, to close a chapter, you don't simply store your treasures, you sacrifice them. When archaeologists use Sanxingdui as a comparison now, they talk about multiple core regions across East Asia. The middle and lower Yangtze, the northeast, the steppe borders, Sichuan, each with its own metals, crops, myths and visual languages. Sanxingdui helped shift that vocabulary, from centre and periphery to network and constellation. Yet for all the breakthroughs, the heart of Shu remains stubbornly opaque. We still don't know what the people called their city. We don't have their own written words explaining what they thought the masks were, why the bronze trees mattered, what songs were sung when the sacrificial pits were filled. We don't know the exact chain of events that led to Sanxingdui's abandonment and Jinsha's rise. We can trace fire, subsidence, shifting rivers, changing trade routes. We can model climate, analyze isotopes in teeth, study residues on artifacts. But the lived experience, the decision in some ruler's mind or in some council, that this place is finished, it is time to go, is beyond our reach. We don't fully understand how Shu and Shang spoke to one another, or if they feared one another, or if they watched each other at a distance like wary constellations in the same sky. We don't know how far Shu's influence stretched along mountain passes, or how many smaller hilltop communities echoed its rituals in miniature. Each excavation answers a practical question and opens a philosophical one, and maybe that's part of why this vanished empire stays lodged in the imagination. There's the drama of it, of course, a kingdom with huge bronzes and golden crowns, gone so completely that later ages barely whispered its name. A farmer's shovel, a factory's clay pit, a construction site, ordinary acts that tore small holes in time and let this world leak back in. But there's something else too. Sanxingdui is a reminder of how thin our knowledge is, even about something as seemingly solid as the Bronze Age. It shows that history is not a finished story we inherit, but a manuscript with entire chapters missing, pages waiting to be found. It invites you to hold your certainty a little more lightly, to imagine that under any familiar narrative there might be another sleeping. That is a strange, calming thought to drift off with. Somewhere, as you listen to this, other forgotten places are resting under fields and neighbourhoods, under roads and warehouses. Their walls are softened to stains in the soil, their altars are collapsed. Their treasures, whatever counted as treasure to them, wait in the dark. Someday, a human hand or a machine or a sensor will brush by and notice something that doesn't quite belong, and a new story will begin to unfold. If you've enjoyed wandering through this one, hearing how a lost Shu kingdom has changed the way we think about early civilizations, you can help this channel keep exploring. If you're still awake, or when you wake up later, you might tap like, or subscribe, or share this with someone else who falls asleep to history. It makes a real difference. And I'd love to know where you are in all of this. What city, what countryside, what coast or inland valley you're listening from, as we talk about rivers and fog on the other side of the world, 3,000 years ago. If you feel like it, leave a comment with where you are, or what part of this story stayed with you. For now, let the questions about Sanxingdui and Shu drift to the back of your mind. The giant bronze eyes can close, the buried masks can rest. The empire that rivaled Egypt slips back into the dark for a while, not forgotten anymore, just waiting patiently in the half-light between what we know and what we might someday uncover.